final harvest in the fall. But they became, of course, Yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt, the giving of the Torah, and the wandering in the wilderness. Now, the giving of each of these holidays is at a different stage when we see it in the Torah text. Pesach has already become the holiday of Yetziat Mitzrayim. The exodus from Egypt is the story of Pesach, and the story is told in Exodus 12, and then further on is exactly that. The Israelites are going out of Egypt, and then the narrative of the exodus from Egypt stops, and it tells you everybody should have a Paschal lamb and serve it with matzot and maror and so on, just because God took Israel out of Egypt. Sukkot is mostly an agricultural festival in the Torah. Only in one line in Vayikra does it say, because I caused the Israelites to dwell in Sukkot when I took them out of the land of Egypt. But everything else about Sukkot is all about harvest. It's all about agriculture. Shavuot is interesting because in the Torah, there is no reference to the fact that the Torah was given on Shavuot. Shavuot in the Torah is purely an agricultural holiday. It was the rabbis who transformed it and made it the holiday of Matan Torah. It's Ban Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of our Torah. Now, it's true, it does say in the beginning of Exodus 19, in the third month after the children of Israel came out of Egypt, and you could say, well, they came out in Nisan, and then there was Iyar, this is the beginning of Sivan. It's sort of the third month. It's not quite 3 months since the Exodus. It's 50 days, as we know very well, because we count them. But the specific linking of Shavuot and Matan Torah is only to be found in the rabbis. It's not to be found in the Torah. Now, as the rabbis read Judaism, Matan Torah, of course, is the most important holiday there is. Everything leads up to it. Pesach, remember, has been made anticipatory. By counting the days from Pesach to Shavuot, we're saying the liberation was there to prepare us for the great moment, the truly great moment of receiving the Torah. We got a taste of freedom on Pesach night when we were raised all the way up, but then we have to work our way back up the mountain and back up to Sinai and back up to being ready to receive the Torah. And that's the great event. That's the great event of Jewish history, Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. And then Sukkot, of course, is the wandering afterwards, the integrating of the learning of Torah. So Sinai is right at the heart. And it's a very powerful tale. And I ask myself, what do we do with it? How do we believe it? How are we loyal to it? I feel a very great power of the story of Israel coming to the mountain, declaring themselves dedicated to God, becoming a mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh, becoming a kingdom of priests and a holy people, and then hearing the divine word. But what do you do if you don't know a God who speaks in human language? Does God speak the Torah? What does God speaking the Torah mean? Is there a voice that comes out of heaven that speaks in perfect biblical Hebrew? Or might Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, mean something else? How can we understand it if we don't want to understand it too literally? And as some people would claim, does Judaism fall apart if you don't understand it literally? If God didn't give the Torah, then why do all those things? Yes? If God didn't say exactly from the mountain, this is what you're supposed to do, then will all of Judaism collapse? Will there be no authority if it's not the word of God? Jews have been struggling with that question for the last 100 years or 200 years. Since the discovery of biblical criticism, since they began entering the Western world and getting a Western education, since we came to understand that speech itself is a human invention. Speech itself is probably less than 50,000 years old. Before that, our primitive ancestors didn't yet have language. Language just began to develop in the last several tens of thousands of years. So what does it mean to say God speaks that language? Or is there another way? Is there another way of appreciating and understanding the story? I begin here with one of the great books I've had the privilege of teaching over and over again in the course of my many years of rabbinic education, of teaching rabbis, is a book by my own teacher, Abraham Joshua Heschel, called Heavenly Torah. In Hebrew, it's called Torah min hashamayim. Heavenly Torah in English, Torah min hashamayim in Hebrew, where he wrote it. Torah min hashamayim literally means Torah from heaven. Torah from heaven. But I remember Heschel getting very excited. It was usually a rather calm lecture. I remember getting very excited one day in class and sort of jumping out of his seat and saying, Torah min hashamayim is not a geographical statement. Torah min hashamayim is not a geographical statement. It doesn't mean necessarily from up there in the sky. Min hashamayim is a way of saying from God. It's divine. And so Gordon Tucker and Len Levin, who translated it, did a very nice thing and said heavenly Torah for Torah min hashamayim. And that already is a comment, that the translated title is already a comment on how Heschel understands what Torah min hashamayim means. What Heschel tries to do is trace the full rabbinic tradition about what it might mean to say that God gives the Torah. And it's a 3-volume work. The second volume is entirely devoted to that question. There's a brand new edition of the book just done by my friend Gerard Bundy here in Jerusalem. And so we've been talking about it a great deal, and it still remains 50 years after Heschel's death, a very exciting and important book. Heschel talks about two ways of understanding revelation. He calls them in Hebrew shitata haflaga b'shitata tzimtzum. Shitata haflaga is spreading it out, increasing it, emphasizing it, expanding, that's what I'm looking for, expanding it. And shitata tzimtzum is contracting it. What does the Torah say was said at Sinai, was given at Sinai? Seems pretty clear that it's the 10 Commandments. Exodus 20, God spoke all these words saying, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God, and then through the 10 Commandments. That's what is spoken at Sinai. The rest of the Torah seems to be given over the course of 40 years wandering in the wilderness. They are constant revelations. That's the view of Rabbi Yishmael among the early rabbis. Rabbi Yishmael says, Klalot ne'emru b'Sinai, pratot bohel moed. The essential principles, the 10 Commandments are the essential principles, the primary rules, they're the klalot. They were spoken at Sinai, but the details were given in the tent of meeting over the 40 years. Rabbi Akiva says no. Rabbi Akiva says, Klalot ufratot ne'emru b'Sinai. Every detail was given at Sinai. So Rabbi Akiva says not only were the 10 Commandments spoken at Sinai, but the entire Torah was spoken at Sinai. Then along come Rabbi Akiva's disciples and say, not just the written Torah was given at Sinai, but even the oral Torah was given at Sinai. This was the Mishnah, the Talmud. It was all given at Sinai. And then another generation comes along and says a famous quotation in the late Talmudic text, Kol mashe talmid vatik atid lechadesh, var ne'amar halacha l'Moshe miSinai. Everything, every new idea that a faithful disciple will ever come up with was already spoken to Moses at Sinai. It was all given to Moses at Sinai. Now, modern Orthodoxy, when it began to define itself over against Reform Judaism, that's what happened. There was a Reform movement, then Orthodoxy was created as an anti-Reform response. Orthodoxy defined itself by taking that as dogma. An Orthodox Jew must believe that every word was given to Moses, every word of the Torah was given to Moses at Sinai. And the authority for the oral law was also given at Sinai. But Heschel tries to tell us that Rabbi Akiva did not mean that as dogma. He did not mean it as dogma. He was a mystic. And that was a mystical insight. What Rabbi Akiva is saying is that Sinai is the kind of moment that transcends time. Past, present, and future were all there at once at Sinai. The same way God's name, Yud He Vav He, is Hayah, Yehiyah, all put together, past, present, and future, all fused together. So Sinai is a moment where eternity is present. Somehow history stops and eternity enters into that moment. And that's the sense in which everything that will ever be said was there at Sinai, because all moments are present in that single mystical moment, a mystical moment that contains all of time within it. That's what Rabbi Akiva meant. But later people who didn't understand it said, no, it's a dogma. You must believe that every word was given at Sinai. Often mystical insights, when they're no longer understood as mystical insights, turn into dogmas. Now, Rabbi Ishmael made the opposite move, or Rabbi Ishmael's school made the opposite move. And Heschel ascribes things to Akiva and Yishmael. They're not necessarily theirs, but the point is there are these different approaches. That was what we call the expansive reading of Sinai. But now there's also a concentrated reading of Sinai. Because even though it says God spoke all these words in the Ten Commandments, in the next chapter it says, Israel said to Moses, Moses, you speak to us and we will listen, but let not God speak to us or we will die. They were terrified. We were all there, remember? So we were terrified at Sinai. So we tried to run away and said, no, Moses, it's too much. You speak to us, don't let God speak to us. There's a view in the Talmud, which Heschel attributes to Rabbi Ishmael's school, which says, Israel said that after only hearing the first two commandments. The first two commandments, I am the Lord your God, and you shall have no other gods beside me, and make no graven images. Those are the first two commandments. After that, Israel said, whoa, it's too much. You tell us the rest, Moses. Now they get this in an interesting way. How many commandments are there in the Torah? 613. The word Torah, the Hebrew word Torah, Tav Vav Resh, is numerical equivalent is 611. Torah is 611. There's a verse in Dvarim that you may know from singing it, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moses commanded us the Torah. So it says Moses commanded us the Torah, which is 611 commandments. The other two commandments we heard from the mouth of God. So the only thing we really heard God speak was, I am the one who brought you out of Egypt, and make no other God beside me. The rest came through Moses. But then there's a more extreme cutting down. Not only to the first two commandments, but maybe only the first word. And this comes from a debate between two people whose names may be known to you, Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, two great Jewish thinkers of the early 20th century. They debated, did Israel hear the first word of Sinai from God's mouth? Or was the first word maybe itself already a commentary? And all they heard was the fact of divine speech. Vaydaber Adonai et kol hadvarim ha'ela. Maybe that's enough. God spoke all these words. But then you go to a Hasidic Rebbe, famous Hasidic Rebbe, Reb Mendel of Rimanov. Reb Mendel of Rimanov, lived at the beginning of the 19th century, said all they heard at Sinai was the first letter, the Aleph of Anochi. The rest came through Moses. God spoke the Aleph and then Moses took over. But, says Gershom Sholem, who's a very smart reader of Hasidism, of Kabbalistic texts, if you take an Aleph without a vowel under it, how does it sound? Right? It's no sound at all. So therefore, all God spoke was silence. And the whole Torah was spoken by Moses. Moses translates God's silence into speech. Now, another Hasidic tradition takes apart the Aleph of Anochi, and says the Aleph of Anochi is really made up of three other letters. If you take a picture of an Aleph, a printed Aleph, it's a Yud on top and a Yud on bottom and a sideways Vav joining them together. So even the aleph can be broken down. And we'll see what that means when we get to our text. But the question is, do we have an expanded reading or a contracted reading of what was spoken at Sinai? And is there a contracted reading that would make sense for a contemporary Jew? Marilyn, let's see the text, if we may. Some of what I just said is in the text, but that's okay, you'll see it again. Look at the Hebrew verse first, please. Moshe yidaber, ve'Elohim ya'anenu b'kol. Moses spoke, and God answered him, responded to him, b'kol. That Hebrew word, b'kol, the last word of the verse, b'kol. B'kol can mean with a voice, but it can also mean aloud. A-L-O-U-D, that kind of aloud. God responded to him aloud. Now let's go down to the English. And I say, Moses spoke, God responded to him in thunder. How do I get thunder? Because the word kol in this chapter, every time it says kolot, it's kolot uvrakim, thunder and lightning. The word kol also means thunderclap. So Moses spoke and God responded to him in thunder. It is this verse that has saved Sinai for me. It is this verse that has saved Sinai for me. What do I mean? What are we to do here at the foot of the mountain? We who do not have a God who uses words, who speaks in human language. In the end, isn't Torah all about a God who speaks? Yes, in speaking of creation, where God said, let there be, we might have taken it as a metaphor. And God said, meaning something other than human language. But here, isn't the whole story here about how God says the words? But here we are. And the verse calls out to us to speak its truth. There was indeed a dialogue at Sinai. Moses spoke in words. God spoke in thunder. It takes a Moses to translate divine thunder speech into human language. He is indeed the Miturgaman, the translator, as our sages said. There's a passage in the Talmud that says, when in the old days, when they read the Torah, they would read the Torah in Hebrew and immediately translate it verse by verse into Aramaic. The Yemenite Jews still do that, by the way. The Yemenite Jews read a verse, translate it into Aramaic, and then into Arabic, every single verse. And the Talmud then says that translator should not raise his voice louder than the Torah reader. How do we know that? Because of this verse, Moses spoke and God responded to him in thunder, which means Moses didn't raise his voice louder than the voice of God. It takes a Moses to translate divine thunder speech into human language. In other words, I'm saying God speaks in thunder. The thunderclaps are divine speech. The falling of rain is divine speech. Yes, the shining of the sun. The shining of the sun is divine speech. Moses knows how to translate divine thunder speech into language. We begin by following what my teacher called Shitata Tzimtzum in describing the verbal content of this moment. Now I'm reviewing what I just told you. First, we follow the biblical text itself, not the whole Torah, but only the 10 Commandments were spoken at the mountain. This is the view of Rabbi Ishmael. But then note the Talmud places Exodus 20:17, you speak with us, Moses, but let not God speak lest we die, after the first 2 commandments. Only these 2 did we hear mipi hagvura, from the divine mouth, from the mighty mouth. The rest were transmitted or translated through Moses. These 2 dibrot come down to, it is I who make you free. Worship nothing else. Now I add something else of my own. Do these really have to be spoken in language? Is it not enough that we hear them in our hearts? And here I get to the core of what I mean by revelation. I believe in revelation, but I do not believe in a God who talks from heaven. What's the difference between those two? The first word, let's take the text off for a minute, please. Go back to faces. The first word that God speaks to human beings in the Torah is what God says to Adam and Eve. What God says to Adam in the Garden of Eden, Ayeka, where are you? Where are you? Now that voice, I believe, comes to Adam from within, in what you might call an instinctive way. I want you to think for a minute about trees and animals. Let's leave human beings. Let's go back before Adam. A tree has a voice within it that says, reach those branches up a little higher and catch some sunlight. Send those roots out a little deeper and grab some water. You need water, you need sunlight. Go get it. That's an inner voice that speaks to it. Every animal has an inner voice that says, eat, thrive, reproduce before you die. That's what animals are all about. Eat, thrive, reproduce. That's all instinct. That's all a voice from within. It's not a physical, it's not a voice in the literal sense, it's not a literal voice, but it's an inner voice that speaks to them. I think once you have human beings and the complexity of the human mind, we also have a voice in us that says, Ayeka, where are you? What are you doing here, fellow? What are you doing here in this world? What's it all for? Figure it out. Come back and tell me. Why are you living? What do you have to do with your life? I think that's the where are you of Eden. That where are you can also be read as Anochi, I am. Here I am, I'm telling you, there is something deeper about this world. There is a divine presence here. And that presence becomes a reality for you. You open your mind and your heart to it, and it is there. I am there. And once you know that, the first commandment is never to betray it. Don't worship anything else as a god. Don't worship beauty, and don't worship money, and don't worship youth, and don't worship all the things we worship and make false gods out of these days. It's not just about wooden idols or metal idols. It's about all the things that we use to replace God, or our values, or distorted values that come in God's place. That's all part of the instinct, I think. So when we say those first two commandments, we heard mipi agvura, from the mouth of God, that's how I mean it. That's how I mean it. We hear that voice from within us. It says, yes, I am here. Yes, there is something more. Make that your focus. Be aware. Don't betray. Now we go back to the text. Thanks for the flexibility. Now we go back to the text. We then go to the conversation between our masters Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Buber. Is it Anochi that we really need to hear spoken by Hashem? Does that suffice with all the rest of Torah flowing from it? Or is that word itself already commentary, and only by Daber Elohim, God spoke as the primary text? Then on to Reb Mendel Rimanov, who offered the Aleph of Anochi as that which contains it all. The Aleph that itself is a silent letter. God speaks in silence. Again, it takes a Moses to translate that silence into words. But Aleph itself, as the Rimanov knew well, is a construct. It is made up of a Yud above, a Yud below, and an angular Vav that joins them. The first Yud is Chochmah, the inner mind of God. The second Yud is Shekhinah, which is Hashem is manifest throughout the world and in our own souls, the God within us. The Vav, which in Hebrew means and, links them together, teaching that the two are one. The God within and the God beyond are the same one. Indeed, that there is only one. And that Aleph is itself the number one. That's what Aleph stands for numerically. It's one. What more does Torah, our teaching, need to teach? That's the essential teaching. There is only one. The God within us and the God beyond us are the same God. The God within and the God beyond are the same God. There is only one. And therefore worship nothing less than that as a God. I may have quoted before to you, I'm not sure, Heschel's statement that we are the image of God. You can't make the image of God, you can only be the image of God. The only medium in which you can make God's image is the medium of your entire life. So being the image of God is over against worshiping idols. So that is a little bit of how I understand Revelation for Shavuot. Yes, I love the picture of Matan Torah, and I will be up all night studying Torah with people for Shavuot and celebrating the moment of Sinai, and we'll notice midnight when the sky is supposed to open, according to old Jewish folk tales. But the real meaning of it is a process of revelation that goes on forever. It's not about loyalty to the one moment of Sinai. It's about loyalty to understanding that opening the heart and mind to the presence of God is what it's all about, and that Sinai is the great entryway to that, or the great metaphor for that. Sometimes I talk about Sinai as what I call a vertical metaphor for an internal event. A vertical metaphor for an internal event. Moses goes up the mountain to receive the Torah. God comes down. For a moment, the borderline between heaven and earth is covered by thick cloud. Is Moses still on the mountaintop? Or has Moses stepped off the mountain and got into heaven? Some agadot, some legends in the Talmud say that Moses, behind that cloud, stepped off the mountaintop and went into heaven, stood before the divine throne. The angels saw him and tried to push him away. They said, what is a human being doing here? And God said to Moses, hold on to my throne so they don't blow you away with their fiery breath. And Moses survives the experience of entering heaven. But other texts say, no, Moses was only on the mountaintop. God came down to the mountain. God didn't want Moses to go too high up, because God wants Moses to be a human being, to be able to relate to others. Moses, remember, has to come up the mountain and come down the mountain and remain a human being. It was a perfect moment for Moses to be transformed into a God. It was a perfect moment for what's called theosis, transformation of human being into God. And we have some elements of it. Moses receives a crown at Sinai. We say in the Shabbat morning service, Klil tiferet b'rosho natata. You placed a crown of glory on his head when he stood before you at Sinai. It sounds almost like he's being deified. Remember, Moses has to wear a mask when he comes down. We know about masks now, because people couldn't bear to look at him. His face shone so brightly. But he's still a human being. He's still going to sin and die. Remember? He's still going to strike that rock and be told you cannot enter the land. And he's immortal. He remains a human being. And that's a very important piece of Judaism, that even the person who goes up the mountain comes back and has to deal with the real world and remains a human being. So Moses comes down. Moses is not completely transformed. But what happens behind the clouds? Somehow the cloud covers the space between heaven and the mountain, and Moses comes down. Somewhere in that act, I think I want to say it's really about an inner experience of Moses. That picture is all vertical. You go up to receive the Torah. God is in heaven. You have to go higher to receive the Torah. But if you ask what is really revelation, really it's not an upstairs, downstairs experience. It's an inner experience. It's an opening of the mind. Maimonides understood that and talked about what prophecy and revelation are. It's an inner experience of transforming the mind. Moses' journey was really an inward journey, not an upward journey. And that's why I say it's a vertical metaphor for an inward experience. He goes to a higher level of the mind, if you will. He goes to a higher level of consciousness. That's what the mountaintop means. That's what the behind the cloud means. It's a higher level of consciousness. It's not actually climbing a ladder into the sky. And that's a kind of reading at Sinai that I can live with. There is still a revelation. There is still something mysterious that happens. Moses is still a key figure for us, but it is not God speaking out of the sky. And you have hints at this, that prior Jewish authors understood it. They may have been afraid to say it openly because it sounded like it was violating the Torah. But if you look on the one hand at Maimonides, where he says revelation is really the mind of the prophet opening itself after studying and preparing in a perfected way to become one with the mind of what's called the divine intellect, the active intellect. Or you look at a Hasidic master who says, when God spoke the Torah first in a single word. God said the whole Torah in a single word. Something the ear could never understand, could never hear, and the mind could never understand. Revelation, he says, was a jumble. Only Moses could sort it out and bring it down commandment by commandment, make 613 commandments of it. Because when God revealed the Torah, the whole thing was there. The whole thing was there in a single word. Which is to say, that's a way of saying divine speech is incomprehensible. It needs a human interpreter. And that places human beings very much in the chain of transmission. The problem with this is, you have to say, if the other commandments came through Moses, was he a perfect transmitter for all time? Or is there changeability? Can we say Moses was a man of his generation? He said things in the Torah that we don't accept in their literal sense. Can we say that Moses was limited and needs to be updated? How much of an originalist are you with regard to the Constitution? Right? Do you say it has to be read just as we like to think it was understood in the 18th century? Or can you say this is a document that's a living document and we have to read it differently in an age when we have automatic weapons, etc., etc. Same thing with the Torah. Do we say it has to be read literally? Do we say it has to be read the way Rashi read it in the 11th century France? Or the way Yosef Karo read it in 16th century Tzfat? Or can we say the Torah has to be read anew in each generation? Of course, that's what I'm doing in some ways. All these texts, all these readings of mine that we're sharing are a new reading of Torah for our generation. But of course, in Judaism, the nitty-gritty is always about practice. Can you change practices? And that's, of course, a dangerous box to open. Classical Reform Judaism did it in the mid-19th century and very much lost the baby with the bathwater and has been struggling now for 50, 70 years to gain it back. And we could say, if I look at the chapter in Numbers that bothers me most in the Torah, in Parshat Matot, where Moses says to the people, "You didn't kill enough Midianites. Go back and kill the women and children." And I have to say, I can't accept that as God's will. I can accept it as something Moses may have thought in the 1300 years or 1200 years before the Common Era. I'm glad it's there because we are admitting that we too are guilty of ethnic cleansing. We too have done it. It's important for me not to take it out. But can I say that's the will of God? That Moses killed the Midianite women and children? I'm not willing to say that. And then some of my friends will say to me, well, once you open that door, there goes everything. And so we struggle with this issue. We struggle with this issue of what a religion of revelation means or can mean to thinking people in our time. I am not claiming here to have all the answers. I've shared with you my approach to this question, my way of thinking about this question, especially for Shavuot, my way of trying to deal with this question. How I'm going to celebrate Revelation in 3 or 4 days from now and staying up all night for it and reading the Torah portion about it and so on, which I love and which is beautiful, beautiful, beautiful text. But I'm not a literalist about it. And exactly what we mean by a non-literalist commitment to Torah, a non-literalist commitment to the text, is something that we all struggle to try to articulate. So thank you for listening to that one. Let's see what you've had to say about it. I imagine there should be some comment, interest, protests coming out of this crowd. So Lev, what you got?
Yes, we got some questions coming in right now. First question. If we were all there at Sinai, aren't we all capable of being translators?
We were all there at Sinai. You even could say we are all there at Sinai. And on some level, each of us does translate for ourselves. I think that's true. But we have a tradition. Moses represents that tradition. We don't say all of us are equal to Moses. We have our own reading. We have our own interpretation of Sinai. But we have tradition and community to keep us from going crazy and to keep us from doing stupid things. You start saying, the voice of God said to me last night to do so and so. I hear the voice of God in this. What's to prevent us? What's to prevent us from going off the deep end with that? I would say we have two things. We have history and tradition, and we have community. Test it out among your friends, see if it makes sense. Test it out against the received tradition, and look at the wisdom the received tradition has derived from that verse, and then look at what you've got there, and you might come back. You might step back from being what's called in the Talmud Migaleh Panim B'Torah Shelo K'Halacha, revealing a reading of Torah which is not the proper way. So I would say yes, on some level, I think you're right. Each of us has to translate for ourselves. I believe that each human being has to take responsibility for his spiritual life. So I think, yes, you do have to translate for yourself, but I think in the shadow of great respect for what Moses has done and what the tradition has done with this text for the last 3,000 years.
Following up with that, I think the Torah says Moses was unique, but are you saying that we all have to be Moses for each other?
Yes and no, no and no, no and yes. Yes, Moses is unique. Lo kam navi od ki Moshe, no other prophet arose like Moses. We recognize the prophecy of Moses as the great spiritual event that founds Judaism. Yes, we have a founder in Moses. We have two founders, of course, Abraham and Moses. When it comes to the Torah, Moses is our founder. And the way Jesus is the founder of Christianity, and Gautama Buddha is the founder of Buddhism, and Muhammad and Islam, and so on, we are all disciples of Moses. We are all Talmidav Shel Moshe Rabbeinu. And I think that's right. Discipleship is a great value in this tradition. And that chain, remember the beginning of Pirkei Avot, which was probably meant to be the concluding summary of the Mishnah. Begins Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai Umisara. Moses received Torah from Sinai, teaching from Sinai, and handed it on and on and on and on and on through the generations. And we are receivers. We are heirs to that gift. So just to say, hey, all of us are Moses, there's no difference. I think becomes too glib, too quick. Yes, we do have to take responsibility. We do have to be willing to say, I am going to be in a place of Moses for my own spiritual life, and maybe for my family, but always in great respect for and the need to learn what the tradition has passed on. That's where we get wisdom from.
Okay, we have fantastic questions here coming in. What is heaven? As in God created heaven and earth. And is revelation an ongoing process?
Revelation is an ongoing process that has many dimensions. I believe that creation itself is a kind of revelation. God is revealed in the natural world. I think every sunrise and every sunset is a revelation, if we open our eyes to it. Revelation, I believe, is constant, always there. When I said the bracha every morning, Pokeach Ivrim, thanking God for opening the eyes of the blind, I say thank you for relieving me of my blindness and helping me notice the wonders of the world, the magnificence of the world. That's Pokeach Ivrim every morning. HaMechadesh b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh b'reishit. God renews the work of creation every day. To me, that's all revelation. Remember the Talmud, the Mishnah says, Be'asara ma'amarot nivra ha'olam. By 10 utterances, the world was created. 10 times in Genesis 1, it says, God said, God said, God said. Turns out there are only 9, and the Talmud says, Bereshit is also a divine statement. Those 10 ma'amarot are repeated at Sinai as the 10 dibrot, commandments. Ma'amar and dibrot are really almost the same thing. So the 10 commandments are really the 10 utterances also in Hebrew. So those are parallel, which means to say God is manifest in creation. So what do you need Sinai for? If God is manifest in creation, and you can find God in sunsets and on mountaintops and in flowers and in beauty and in love and in babies being born and everything else, why do you need revelation? Why do we need Sinai? Sinai is a guidebook to tell you how to find God in creation, how to find the presence of God in the world. And it's very important. It takes those ma'amarot, those creative utterances, and repeats them, but this time in the imperative. This time in the imperative. How do you respond to the presence of God in the world? It's not just, isn't that lovely? It's not just a sense of beauty. The great Christian philosopher Kierkegaard talked about the difference between the aesthetic and the religious voice. The aesthetic voice appreciates the beauty of the natural world, the beauty of creation, but the religious voice says, what does this call on me to do? How does this call on me to live? How do I respond? How do I respond to that voice? That's a different level of reality. So God is revealed in creation, God is revealed always, but Sinai is a revelation with imperatives. And I'm using the word imperatives, I don't think, remember, I'm not saying there's a fellow in the sky who says, don't you eat that cheeseburger. And that's not the kind of imperative I'm talking about. I'm talking about how do we respond to the presence of God in the world? What does it call upon us to do? It may call upon us not to eat cheeseburgers for a whole series of reasons, but that's a different story. There was a first part to that question that was different. So that's a way in which revelation is constant, I believe, yes? But
Yeah.
what was the first part of that question?
The first part, I think, is asking for your opinion on the definition
What
of
is heaven?
Yeah.
What is heaven? Yes. Well, so when Heschel said Torah mina shamayim is not a geographical statement, Torah from heaven is not a geographical statement, what did he mean? I think he might mean that heaven also exists in the human heart. That heaven is a state of mind or a state of well-being, a state of wholeness. Remember, wholeness and shalom are the same root in Hebrew. And God is oseh shalom bimromav. God makes peace in those high places. So the midrash on oseh shalom bimromav is God takes esh umayim, fire and water, and puts them together. And if you take the word esh and the word mayim, you sort of get shamayim, heaven. But I would say that fire and water are really elements of human personality. How do fire and water live together in the person? How do love and mercy on the one hand, and justice and demand on the other hand, live together in the person? I think that's all about the creation of shamayim. So I'm generally, remember, I'm an internalist as distinct from a verticalist. So that the shamayim on the other side of the sky, which is what the ancestors believed, I don't think there's another side to the sky. The sky isn't something that has another side. The heavens are the heavens, and we can talk about the expanding universe, the contracting universe, but I don't think of transcendence, meaning that God is out there on the other side of the sky. I believe transcendence is right here. God is present in this place, in this moment, in such a profound way that we'll never get it. And that's the transcendence, that's the mystery. And I don't need in that sense, a literal sense of what the word heaven means.
Does the vertical metaphor also apply within ourselves? During our transformations, I think this is also a question, the second part. During our transformations, do they originate in Keter and move lower through all the Sfirot and out into the world through Malchut?
Well, bravo for knowing the sporadic chart. That's good. But the sporadic chart is often presented vertically with Keter on top and Malchut on bottom. But it is sometimes presented circularly. Because the oldest text we have that mentions the word Sfirot is Sefer Yetzirah, which is a text that goes back to very early, probably Talmudic or pre-Talmudic times. And Sefer Yetzirah, when it introduces the word Sfirot, says, Na'utz sofan tchilatan b'sofan b'tchilatan. Their beginning is tied to their end, and their end is tied to the beginning. That's like the mythical figure of the Ouroboros, the snake that's swallowing its own tail. It's the mystic circle where the end goes back to the beginning and the beginning goes back to the end. We have a reference to that in Lecha Dodi. Likrat Shabbat l'chuven elcha ki mikor habracha merosh mikedem nisucha sof ma'aseh v'machshava tchila. The end of deed was the first in thought. The Shekhinah, Malchut, the 10th of the 10 Sfirot, is actually up there in the first. Is actually up there in Machshava. And so the circularity of the Sfirot is very important to me. The vertical image of the Sfirot is medieval. And the medieval world was a very hierarchical world. a very hierarchical world in terms of social class, in terms of immobility, in terms of gender, needless to say, in terms of Jews also being on the bottom of the heap, needless to say, and therefore needing their own vertical metaphors. But we live at a time where hierarchy does not have such a good name. And so I think I like the circular image of the Sfirot, where you go down to Malchut and back into Keter, and Keter is Malchut. And I think that to me is a more dynamic and contemporary way of reading the Sfirot. So the inner journey is ultimately not a vertical journey. No, the inward journey is about layer of consciousness after layer of consciousness. It's a journey deeper into the self, and maybe into the self of the universe, not just into the individual self.
Can you address the Ten Commandments? In God's wisdom, God chooses to give the Ten. I think this is also a question, this second part. In God's wisdom, does God choose to give the Ten Commandments as his greatest wisdom?
I think the Ten Commandments are what Judaism treasures as its central wisdom. I cannot use that literalist language. God decides to give the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are the essence of what we understand the Torah to teach. And I think there is great profundity to be learned from them. We spend our lives studying them and commenting on them. Remember, all the commandments of the Torah are said to be rooted in the 10. There's a whole genre of poetry in Hebrew called Azharot that some people study on Shavuot, which shows how each of the 613 commandments is derived from one of the 10. But then some people, especially in Hasidism, said the whole Torah is derived from the first two commandments. The first commandment, I am Lord your God, is the source of all the positive commandments. And the second commandment, not to make idols, is the source of all the prohibitions. So everything is there in the two. But that is certainly to be taken as the core of Judaism as a wisdom tradition. Is there in the Ten Commandments? They're not the only thing we have. We have wonderful wisdom literature in Proverbs, in Job, and so on. But the core, I would say, the core wisdom of the Jewish tradition can be said to be the Ten Commandments. Yes. Shall we move on? Second text.
Sure.
Let's go on to a different text. We spent a lot of time in this one, but I wanted to, especially because it's probably the most essential issue, but it's also, of course, preparing for Shavuot. But now we'll go to the next parsha. We'll go to Mishpatim. And this is a favorite of mine. It's a teaching based on something somebody else said. But I learned a lot from it, and I remembered it over the course of more than 50 years. Let's go down to the English. Now, you remember the Parshat Mishpatim is a legal chapter. This is the parsha right after Sinai. The people have this great experience, the thunderclaps, and the mountain smoking, and so on, and the people are terrified. And then the next parsha is, these are the statutes, these are the judgments you should place before them. So sometimes you want to say, well, what happened? What happened? We had a great night at Sinai there, and we woke up the next morning, and there's Moses gotten older with a raspy voice saying, all right, here's the law, folks. These are the things you have to do. This is what you signed up for last night when you were in the ecstatic trance. You didn't know, but here are the laws. At first glance, this appears to be an abrupt change. Until now, Torah has been a narrative, a book of stories. Remember, the Torah began with creation, and then went through Noah and Abraham and all the patriarchs, and then the Exodus from Egypt, and then the beginning of the wanderings in the wilderness, the splitting of the Red Sea, and then Sinai. It was all narrative. All of a sudden, it's changed. Until now, Torah has been a narrative, a book of stories. to learn from it, because Torah means teaching after all, has been to learn from those stories, to seek out wisdom from the words in which they are told. Now suddenly Torah seems to turn into a code of laws, and the fear arises in us that perhaps all this long narrative has just been an introduction to the law code. A memorable Dvar Torah from our Chavurah more than half a century ago, the person who originally said this Dvar Torah is named Joel Rosenberg. He's been a professor of Jewish literature at Tufts University for many years, has helped me read it differently. The narrative does not stop here. Each mishpat or judgment listed here is the result of a story. This is a collection of case laws for the lawyers in the community. This is a collection of case laws, not an abstract code. That also accounts for its seemingly haphazard order. Here's how it goes. Sometime shortly after Sinai, there was a man who owned a slave because of a debt. When the time of bondage was over, the man refused to go free, not wanting to leave his wife and kid behind. So they came and asked Moses. Then there was a guy with a daughter. Terrible story about a guy with a daughter. Let's take a look at it and see. Mishpatim. What's right after the Hebrew slave in Mishpatim? The first story is a story of a man and his daughter. And it's a little bit of a frightening story. If a person sells his daughter into servitude, she shall not go out with the other servants. She should not leave with the other servants. If she does ill in the eyes of her master, then he redeems her to a non-Jewish, to a non-Israelite, he may not sell her because he has, etc., etc. The details aren't important. I'm reading it from the Hebrew and translating on the spot. So there's a man with a daughter, and then it says, "Makeh ish v'met." If a person hits a person and he dies, that person gets the death penalty. And then it says, but if this just happened, was an accident and not intentional murder, there's no death penalty. And then it says a kidnapper who kidnaps a person and sells him, he shall die. So it's a series of laws. There was a guy with the door. Then there were two guys who had a fight, and one of them died. Then there was this terrible story in the camp of a kid who killed his parents. Person who killed his parents is put to death. All these are readings from the case book of Moses' court. In fact, the vav with which it begins, ve'ela hamishpatim, traditionally seen as linking that to which comes before, directly ties these chapters back to chapter 18, where Jethro advises Moses to set up courts. Exodus 18:26 reads, "They shall judge the people constantly. The hard things they shall bring to Moses, but small matters they shall judge themselves." Here we have a list of the hard things as they came up. It's as though Moses was taking notes, or he had a secretary who took notes of the cases as they came up one after another. They got written down as laws for the sake of precedence. But these are real stories with real people behind each one. A Jewish praxis based on the Talmud, which is full of stories, rather than unintentionally abstracting codes, would look a lot closer to this. Halacha and Agadah, nomos and narrative, though some of you may know of the famous essay by Robert Cover, who grew up on Halacha v'Agadah, are intertwined at each moment. But think also about your own life this way. Why do you do X or Y? Because of a certain story, a certain memory. Something happened. A story came up and you decided to act in a certain way because of that narrative, because of that story. We get our code of praxis out of narrative, out of stories. The great Hebrew poet Chaim Nachman Bialik wrote a wonderful essay, which if you've never seen, you should take a look at. It's only about 10, 15 pages, called Halacha and Agadah, where he uses these two principles. You could call them narrative and nomos, narrative and law, Halacha, Agadah and Halacha. And he talks about the interplay between them, how Agadah, how the narrative crystallizes and creates a practice in response to that narrative. But then that practice creates another narrative around it. And another practice comes out of that. And there's this interesting dialectical relationship between the praxis of Judaism and the narrative and the story of Judaism, the tale that Judaism is telling. And I think that's how to read the legal section of the Torah. That it's all a series of narratives. Sometimes we get the narrative. A person was seen gathering sticks on the Sabbath, and Moses didn't know what to do with him. And then a voice came out and told Moses what his fate should be. Sometimes we get that, but often we just get series of laws. But I want to say that behind each of these laws, there is a dramatic and sometimes a tragic story. We're going to have a law in Bamidbar coming up in here in Israel. It's this week's parsha. I think in America it's still a week later for you, in Parshat Naso, about the sota, about the suspected wife and this terrible trial by ordeal she has to go through. But behind that law, there must be a story about some guy who came to Moses and said, "I suspect my wife has been cheating on me. And what do we do about it?" And the right was created because of a real human couple and a real human situation. And each of these has real people behind it. I think one of the things which we try to do, is to get the law to recognize that each case has a real person, and that real people and their lives will be governed by these laws. So whether we're talking about handguns, or we're talking about Roe, or we're talking about anything else that comes up in the legal world, always remembering the real human beings who lie behind the abstract formulations of law is I think what the Torah is trying to have us do here. So the connection, this is the moment of the connection, somehow between the narrative and the legal text. It's important. It's an important moment to notice, but to notice that the legal text is also a human document. It's also talking about real people and having concern with real people in their lives. So let me stop there and give us a little bit more time for some conversation.
Okay, I haven't received any questions from our students for this particular piece. Would it be okay to ask you a question about the last piece, or do you want to just?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Here's one. If silence is the origin of revelation, then how do we trust Moses to have gotten it right for the time period that we're in? I mean, I think you addressed this a little bit. Would Torah change, or is it already there and we just need simply to find it?
It's not easy to accept an either or on that. It's not easy to accept an either or. We have Maimonides standing as the guardian of tradition, who says this Torah will never be changed. It will be there forever, and nothing may be changed in it. Lo yachalifa el, lo yamir dato. The law will never be changed. And yet we know that the rabbis themselves changed the law. Yes, there were things in the Torah that were expanded greatly by the rabbis. I presume you all know the story, but I'll tell it anyway, about God saying to Moses, "You shall not cook a calf in its mother's milk." And Moses says, "Oh, you want us to separate milk and meat completely, right?" And God says, "I said, you shall not cook a calf in its mother's milk." And Moses says, "You want us to wait 6 hours between eating meat and drinking milk?" And God says once more, "You shall not cook a calf in your mother's milk." And Moses says, "You mean separate dishes, separate dish towels, separate sinks?" And God says, "Go ahead, do it your way." So that's there's a big gap between what the Torah says and what we do about separating milk and meat. There's a famous case in the Talmud where the Talmud says that the Torah says a person who sins in a certain way should be given 40 lashes. And the rabbis took one away. They only gave 39 lashes because they wanted to show mercy. Yes, but the Torah says 40. So they changed it. There are things that were added and things that were changed. Halakha has gone through a great evolution over time. And it continues to change. The question is, what's the process? What's the process and how careful do you have to be? We want to be faithful to tradition and we want to make some changes. And the tremendous change made in this generation of women's full participation in Jewish life is an amazing, amazing change. The new generation now doesn't notice it anymore because they, of course, grew up with it already. But many of you here remember, remember that it wasn't always that way. I am the Jew I am because I had to have a bar mitzvah to please my grandmother. But my sister didn't get a day of Jewish education because girls didn't have to do that because there was no bat mitzvah in those days, etc., etc. And that's a change. That's a change. We have to recognize that there are changes. Does every change have to have a precedent within the legal system? Or can we sometimes say, no, the legal system didn't understand things as we understand them today, and therefore going to make the change even though the precedent isn't there. And there was a great debate within the conservative movement when the issue of homosexuality came up about 10 or 15 years ago. And they wanted to make the change. They wanted to make the change, even though the Torah verse of male homosexuality is quite explicit. They wanted to make the change. And there were several different versions of proposals placed before them. I won't go through all the details, I don't remember them all, but several of them tried to find precedents and tried to find legal devices of how you could possibly change a law, even though it's so clear. And then there was one opinion that by Rabbi Gordon Tucker, who said, no, we just don't believe that anymore. We just need to change the value and say, this is the way we understand human sexuality today, and the Torah didn't understand it, and we are making the bold move. And they chose to accept the other alternatives as legitimate and not his, because that was outside the halachic process of the conservative rabbinate. It was to say we are just changing because we know differently, we think differently, was and forgive me if I'm distorting the details of that case. I don't remember all the bits and pieces, but that was the gist of it. And they said no to that. We don't break with precedent. But they did, of course, change their policy, and the conservative movement does ordain openly gay people and so on, as I think they should. But they wanted to do it through a more conservative kind of legal formulation. And that's the question: do we always try to find the precedents and try to find change and struggle very hard and sometimes fail? There are still women who are suffering terribly as agunot, as women who can't get divorces, because the rabbis have not figured out how to change that law that says only a man can give a divorce and can hold a woman from remarrying if he refuses to, and can blackmail her for that and so on. And that's a terrible thing. And yet we haven't found within the Orthodox community, at least, rabbis who have the courage to just say, we need to change that. We cannot allow the law to torture people that way, to ruin people's lives that way. And the question is always, how far do you go? What's precedent setting? And if you let this slip, are you going down the slippery slope to a kind of watered down Judaism that won't be rich and spiritually rewarding and appealing to people? And you do have the example of radical reform, as I say, that felt it went too far and is having a very hard time climbing back up that hill. And so, the answer is not simple.
This is a question from me personally. Reb Zalman, I remember him teaching that Shavuot was a time of receiving our deployment papers. Sort of a military term. So my question is, do you see it that way? And if so, how do we best prepare to receive our instructions?
Well, you may guess that military metaphors are not my favorites. Zalman grew up in Chabad, remember, and they had Sivos Hashem. They were the army of God, and they had mitzvah tanks out there on the streets and so on. That's not my very favorite kind of spiritual language. Let's put it that way in somewhat gentle terms. But yes, I do see it as our deployment. I very much believe that we are a covenanted people. We are a people who declared at Mount Sinai that we wanted to bear the word of God and that we wanted to help bring it to the world. And that's what we do. That's what we should be doing. And we have to be deployed in a way to do that. And I think different people have different deployments, if you want to use that word. Sometimes we ask it this way, in a much more Jewish way. What is your particular mitzvah? Yeah, we're obligated to do lots of mitzvahs. Maybe you can say all the mitzvahs. But every person has a particular mitzvah that belongs to her soul or his soul. Can you find your mitzvah for this year? Can you find your mitzvah for this year? And make that something very special for you. Make that something you learn about, something you take great care in practicing. You do it with special love, and that becomes for a particular Shavuot, in the year that follows it. That becomes your mitzvah. And there are lots of mitzvahs waiting to be done like that, as you know. As you know, I've been talking here in Israel. I've met several people who have been back and forth working with refugees, working with Ukrainian, some Jewish, sometimes Jewish, and sometimes general Ukrainian refugees in the border areas of Moldavia and Hungary and Poland. And they have incredible stories to tell, and I'm just so impressed with people who just interrupt their lives and go there to do a mitzvah and say, I'm needed there, and that's the more important thing to do. And have left the comfort of their homes and gone off to do that. And there is something miraculous or something wondrous about people's ability to do things like that. You think about people who risk their lives for others all the time, whether first responders or firefighters or what have you, who are out there doing mitzvahs in the very real and absolute sense. A mitzvah that you really can't be fully rewarded for. And you don't do it for the sake of reward because you could be doing something else, probably earning better money than doing those high risk jobs. And yet people do them. So I think those are some of the mitzvahs. I mean, I think there are mitzvahs within the ritual world too that can become your special mitzvah for a particular year or a particular Shavuos.
Lev, you're muted.
You muted yourself, Lev.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. A question came in. I think it's about a follow-up on how we reinterpret Torah. The question is, what about the responsa? And an example is given here, for instance, not allowing a castrated male into the sanctuary.
Yes, I'm not sure exactly what that has to do with responsa. Of course, when I talked about this question of homosexuality in the conservative movement, those were responsa by various rabbis to that question. And there are passages in the Torah that are very hurtful to certain kinds of people. Whether it's a castrated person or a person who is legally defined as a mamzer, as a bastard who can't come into the community. There are various laws that are very harsh and harmful to certain human beings. And I think those are the places where making changes are most needed. I'm very much a traditionalist in terms of my style of observance of Judaism. But where there is an ethical demand to make a change, I feel we have to confront it. But if there are people who are harmed by some of those restrictions, now the truth is there's no temple, and nobody says that a person who is sexually deformed, or however you want to say it, castrated, can't come into a synagogue. Certainly nobody knows and nobody checks. And I hope that nobody is trying to use those verses now against trans people, if that's what you have in mind. And I haven't heard that that's the case. But I fear it could be. Now that you say it, I fear it could be. It seems to me that would be an improper extension of a law which has nothing to do with the synagogue, but only has to do with the temple, which is not currently standing. And so I don't think there should be any legal basis for it. I know it says lo yavo bi kal Hashem, but kal Hashem there I think is taken to mean the temple. I don't think it's taken to mean the community. So I would not put too much concern on that one.
Speaking of a person having a mitzvah, as their possible deployment, is this mitzvah like the spark that belongs only to one person and that person has to gather it?
Yes, it's another version of it, but the mitzvah is something you have to do. And gathering the spark, you could say you never know where that spark will be. And so wherever you find yourself, you look for it. But a mitzvah is active. The mitzvah is you pick a mitzvah and you work on it. My mitzvah this year is going to be Hachnasas Orchid, welcoming guests, making my home more open to people. And then you work on that, you design it, you get whether you get the furniture for it or the places where you're going to welcome people from, you sort of set yourself up to do that mitzvah in a special way. My mitzvah is going to be a Shabbos candle. So you set yourself up to remember them and to get them, and maybe you get yourself new candle holders or something like that, and you say, this is my special mitzvah this year. So it's an active thing, and I think it requires preparation. That's a little different than the spark, which could be just found anywhere. Now you may say you've got to be prepared for that spark too, and you'll be prepared for it wherever you go. But I think I would say a particular mitzvah is more set and more demanding.
Where did new interpretations come from? What rules them in or out?
They are the process of oral Torah. And oral Torah lives inside us. It lives inside Jews. I think I may have quoted for you before, I'm not sure, that wonderful interpretation of the Sfas Emes, the 19th century Hasidic master in Poland. On the bracha we say after we have an aliyah. It says, Asher natan lanu Torah emet. God gave us the Torah of truth. That's the written Torah, he says. V'chaye olam nata b'tochenu. He implanted eternal life within us. That's the oral Torah. Where is the oral Torah? The oral Torah lives inside us. And he says, only when those two come together, the written Torah, which is tradition, and the oral Torah that lives inside us, then Asher Natan Lanu Torah Emet is turned into the present tense. You say, Baruch Atah Hashem Noten HaTorah. Then God gives the Torah again. God's giving the Torah again because we are interpreting the Torah. because we are using the holiness within us, the inner divine voice within us, as a way of interpreting the Torah anew. That's the creative process in Judaism. So Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah, is a set of books on a Beit Midrash shelf. Look at a set of the Talmud. That's the oral Torah. No. The oral Torah is a living product. The oral Torah still lives inside us.
All right, just
So, yes.
I think
So
you
where-
may.
Go
I think
ahead.
you may be touching your computer. It's giving off noises,
Okay, I'll be good and put it down.
obfuscating your words.
Yes. So the oral Torah lives inside us, and it's an ongoing process. Now the question: how do we know if we make a mistake in interpreting the Torah? How do we know if we go too far in reinterpreting the Torah? And there I have to say again, we have tradition, and we have a community we live in that helps give us answers to those questions. You should have enough of a chavrusa. You should have enough of a close community or a partner in study who can say to you, Art, you're crazy. That's not a proper reading of the Torah. Or that's going too far. Think about it again. Or I should be able to go back to the sources and say, the sources never read it that way. Do I think I really need to reinterpret that radically? What for? What's pushing me to reinterpret that radically? Is there an ethical demand that I reinterpret that radically? If there is, maybe I should be open to it. If there isn't, maybe I should vote for tradition unless there's a pressing need to vote otherwise. I think that's generally the way I go. Vote for tradition unless there's a pressing moral, ethical need to go otherwise. Because I know this Torah only from the tradition. The written Torah did not come to me because I had a dream last night. The written Torah comes to me from tradition. And so my right to reinterpret it has to do with my relationship with that Torah and my faithfulness to that Torah. To just be arbitrary and say, okay, I think I'll change this today, I think I'll change that tomorrow, that trivializes the whole enterprise. We are engaged. We are engaged with Torah. Remember, la'asok divrei Torah. We say the bracha to be engaged with words of Torah. And that engagement requires a very deep commitment and knowledge. And that gives us a basis for freedom to reinterpret.
All right,
it's nothing.
I want to make sure that we have time for this one last question that I promised the student I would ask. This is going back to last week. Since so many of the prayers in the prayer book are filled with praise and petitions, reinforcing the idea of a God out there, do you think there's a need for a revision of the prayer book to help us think of God in a different way?
Yes. Yes, but I think it has to happen slowly, gradually, not cut us off from the past. I've written a commentary on the prayer book, which tries to do just that through comment. I've been around a long time, and I've been through several generations of people trying to change the prayer book. And I find it often doesn't work very well. So my method is more reinterpretation than changing the text. My reinterpretation, my interpretation, my commentary in the prayer book is really an answer to the question, how can a guy who believes like you say these words? And I try to build those bridges between my own faith and what the words say. At some point, I think some of the words have to be changed or added to, yes. I remember a conversation with people when I was involved with the Reconstructionist movement, which takes me back 30 years. And they were putting out a new prayer book, and I was in charge of the Hebrew text. People said, wouldn't it be great if instead of saying Eloheinu melech haolam, our God, King of the universe, eternal King, we said Eloheinu ruach haolam, the spirit of the universe? Isn't that more what we mean? Isn't it more universal spirit than universal king? Let's make the change. And then somebody else said, if there are 6 words that Jewish kids in this world know, other than Shema Yisrael, it's Baruch Atah Hashem Eloheinu Melech HaOlam. Do you want our children not to know the same 6 words that every other Jewish child in the world knows? And so if you look at the Reconstructionist prayer book published that year in Birchot HaShachar, they go back and forth. Ruach HaOlam, Melech HaOlam, Melech HaOlam, Ruach HaOlam. They do every other one, they go back and forth, because they didn't want to make that break, even though ideologically, of course, it made much more sense to get rid of that Melech language. Yes, but there's good reason to hold back, and that's the length of the tradition and the universality of our religious language. And indeed, to be able to walk into a synagogue in South America or the Far East or Europe or anywhere else and to open the book and have the same words, there is something very powerful about that. And I don't think it's trivial. So the answer is yes and no again, once more. Okay, Laila Tov, everybody. Have a wonderful Shavuot. Enjoy the goodies and also enjoy the learning.
Thank you, Rabbi Green. Chag Sameach to everyone. Be well. See you next week.
Thank you.